and I'm the coordinator of Village Voices. You've just been told that the meeting is being recorded, and you should realize that we are going to have this recorded and it will be posted on the Village's Facebook and YouTube channel. Now, as we proceed here, we'd ask you to mute yourself during the presentation, and then we'll have a period of question and answer toward the end of the presentation. If you have a question that you're just dying to ask and you're afraid you're going to forget it by the end of the presentation, please do use the chat. And Mary Bloodworth and I will try to watch the chat and see who's got questions, and we'll make sure we get to you when the Q&A period begins. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, then let me tell you about the rest of the programs for the spring. The March event will be with Don Cohn. He's a distinguished economist who lives here on the Hill, of course, and his title is COVID, Biden, Putin, the Fed, Who Done It and What's Next? And after this past week of economic news, I should think that would be very interesting to us all. Our speaker in April is Charles Downey, who is a local music critic. He's going to be talking about the future of classical music in Washington, as he sees it. In May, we have a historian named Toby Mayer, who is going to be talking about China and how China today views its history. And then in June, we have Kevin Mallinson, who's going to be talking about how to survive when you're in an occupation that is basically gendered and you're not of that gender. So that's the spring lineup, and we hope you join us for as many of those as you can. So today we have with us Jane Campbell. She's the director of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. She comes to us having been the mayor of the city of Cleveland, where she was the first female mayor of Cleveland. And that has to be a story in and of itself, but she's not telling that story tonight, I don't think. She then came here to Washington. She worked on Capitol Hill, often on the Senate side for a variety of senators and committees. And since 2019, she's been the director of the Capitol Historical Society. And once January 6th happened, she had the idea that we needed to document this by having people tell their stories, their oral history of the events of January 6th. And since all of us lived so close to the Capitol and have our own stories of what it felt like to be in Washington at that time, I know we're all interested. So Jane, welcome to Village Voices. It's yours.
Thank you, Trudy and Mary. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate being here. I feel very fondly toward the village because I am a Capitol Hill resident. Live right over on the southeast of the Capitol. And when all the fences went around, my house was a block away from the fence line. So January 6th was very real to me. I've got a few pictures that I'm going to do in the screen share. And so I want to first put the screen share on so you can see these, and we're going to do this as quickly and easily as possible. But I want to, there. Okay, now it's full screen, right? You can see it. This is, you understand the Capitol Historical Society is a nonprofit organization chartered by Congress, but not funded by Congress. And so we always have to have what we call the NPR moment. We appreciate your contributions. And so this is our commercial moment. So let's talk about the January 6th Oral History Project, which is what you asked me to talk about. January 4th was Monday. January 6th was a Wednesday. Our offices are at the VFW building, which is at the right across the street from the Hart Senate office building at Maryland and 2nd, if you can picture where that is. And I we were at that time, remember 2021, we were just starting to come back in person a little bit. We were in a hybrid mode at our office where we had some people were working still from home, some people were coming in. What we'd sort of worked out is that you could come in if you were comfortable. And the people who were coming in were mostly people who could walk in. People were not comfortable taking the metro. There were a few people who drove and were willing to drive in, but we weren't full staff by any stretch of the imagination. But on Monday, I looked at what was going on and I said to my team, I want everybody working from home on Wednesday. I have a bad feeling about January 6th. I just don't think it's going to be safe. And then January 6th happened. And it was, in fact, we all watched it from our homes on the television, just like so many Americans and probably many of you. And if you lived on Capitol Hill like I do, you watched it on TV and you heard it outside. It was very much, happening in the neighborhood. And of course, being a person who works with people on the Hill, worked on the Hill myself, as I watched what was going on, I knew every step that they were taking. And I knew people who were in the building at that time. And we were all on the phone to each other and texting and calling and, doing all kind of things that I suspect you all were doing the same thing. And, we all have moments and stories about that. And one of mine is my daughter called me, and my daughter is 30, well, she's now 35, but she was 33 at the time. And, somehow your kids think you can work magical, you have magical powers. And she said, Mommy, I need you to stop what's going on at the Capitol. And I said, oh yeah, I'll get right on it, and she said, no, Rashid, I just talked to Ashley, who's one of her friends from college, who's married to Rashid, who's one of her friends from high school. And she said, Rashid is in the Capitol and he got called up. He's a DEA agent. And when there was that period when they couldn't reach an agreement on calling the National Guard, but Attorney General Bill Barr could bring up all the federal agents who were in the Guard. So I look at the television and here is Rashid. To me, this kid who grew up in my basement, doing all the crazy things that high school kids do. I knew that he'd grown up, he was in the Air Force and he's, responsible adult, all that kind of stuff. And he's in his full fatigues leading senators through the tunnels to safety. And Jesse's like, would you just call? We just need to know Rashid's going to be okay because Ashley's freaking out. They have 2 little kids. And I'm like, I can't promise you that. I know this is, so think about what it was like for someone who was in there or people who had someone they loved who was in the Capitol. And that was what we wanted to capture with the January 6th oral history program. But just to give you a sense of context, before we got into the January 6th oral history, I want you to know the first question that we got asked is this the most unusual thing that's ever happened? Has it ever happened before? And of course, the last time there were large numbers of people in was the British in 1814 during the War of 1812. But there had been times where Americans did try to inflict violence on the Capitol. In 1815, Erich Munter, who was a college professor, also went by Frank Holt. He was a German nationalist, and he wanted to prevent the United States from supporting Great Britain in World War I. So in the night of July 2nd, 1915, he took 3 sticks of dynamite into the Capitol, and his idea was that he would blow up the Senate. But he found that it was locked, so he put his sticks of dynamite in the Senate reception room. And this is what the Senate reception room looked like afterwards. It detonated at 11:40 p.m. No people were injured, and the suspect was apprehended the next day. Then we go on to 1954, when there were what's the Puerto Rican nationalist shooting. This is an interesting story. 1954, they had just there was concern about cameras coming in to the hall, to the chamber by the public. And so these guys who came in, the shooters, they were asked at the door. They had bags. They were asked at the door, "Do you have a camera?" They said no. They didn't have a camera. They weren't asked if they had a gun. And they had guns and began from the gallery shooting the members, and the members were carried out by the Capitol pages. There were 4 members who were hurt. None of them ultimately died, but it was a serious situation. And up until the time of the 1954 bombing, the Capitol Police had really been a patronage operation. You got to be a Capitol Police officer because you knew somebody who was in Congress. And basically the Capitol Police officers were tour guides. They told you where things were, but they weren't really trained police officers. And so there was a big discussion about professionalizing the operation of the Capitol Police. And there was quite a debate. One of the proposals was that there would be bulletproof glass put between the gallery and the chamber. And that became the proposal that was known as Congress under glass. And the members of Congress absolutely felt that that violated who we were as Americans, that part of our story is that we are open to participation. And Representative Louis Rambolt from Michigan gave a classic speech where he said, "For generations, tourists, travelers from abroad, and most important, our school children have visited Congress and observed the workings of the world's freest legislature with a sense of intimacy and participation. Here was freedom's biggest and longest running show, playing to audiences who felt inspiration and awe. Let us not seal it off by symbols of fear, such as dictatorships necessarily must employ." And so that is, we then move to 1971 and the Weather Underground organization, which was a terrorist group that was seeking to overthrow American imperialism and protesting the United States military engagement in Laos, decided that they were going to also bomb the Capitol. And they called, this is an interesting one. So early hours in the morning of March 1st, 1971, they left a bomb in an unmarked men's bathroom on the Senate side of the Capitol. But they called the switchboard before the bomb was to go off to warn people so that no people would get hurt. And when they called to warn about the bomb, the Capitol Police, who you remember still were mostly patronage operation, couldn't find the bomb, even though they were within feet of it. And so at that point, patronage and the police parted ways. And the Capitol Police became a more sophisticated actual police operation. They instituted camera surveillance, bag searches of all persons, and 10 entrances had X-ray machines and metal detectors. And again, there was, as always there is, a question, shall we shut down the access to the Capitol? And again, the Congress said no. Senator Jennings Randolph from West Virginia said, protection of the Capitol is a complex and delicate matter. We must secure it against attack while providing security to all citizens and free access to this symbol of our liberty. Adam Clayton Powell went on to say, it would be a pity to diminish the freedom with which Americans have always gained access to the halls of Congress. Indignation over this occurrence should not breed intemperance or vindictiveness. This is a time for Congress to keep its head. So we move to the 1983 resistance conspiracy bombing. And this is the first time we had a group led by women. And they were protesting military engagement in Lebanon and Grenada. Again, 10:58 p.m., they planted a bomb. And this one, again, on the Senate side, blew off the office door at Robert Byrd's office. And just hours before this bombing, Congress had signed into law a number of new security measures to expand metal detectors to every entrance, to clear the hallways in the immediate adjacent to the chambers, to move the barriers for vehicular traffic outside the Capitol, and the new system of Capitol ID badges, which you now see all over the place, was instituted after 1983. And again, there was a push. Shall we close public access? And again, Lee Hamilton, by this time, was in the Senate, and he was really stern on this. He said, the Capitol is a symbol of free and open government, so there's always a chance that the unbalanced, dangerously unbalanced person will slip in with the crowds who want to come to see their government at work. Most legislators understand that openness of the Capitol makes an important statement about the kind of people we are. Public access to the Capitol must be maintained, even if there is some risk to those who come and visit there. And then in 1998, we had the lone deranged gunman, Russell Eugene Weston, a mentally ill individual who was not taking his medication, came to the metal detector. The officer said, stop, there's something here. He pulled his gun, shot the guy immediately. And in the course of chasing him, 2 officers died. At that point, Congress passed the bill that authorized the creation of what we now know as the Capitol Visitor Center, because they wanted to create a safe way for there still to be public access. They were unwilling to give up the public access. And, at that point, Eleanor Holmes Norton was already in Congress, and she gave a very passionate speech saying, the Capitol is a temple of democracy and is the most important symbol of the open society in which we live. It is more so than the White House, in part because the president's workplace is also a residence and cannot be entirely open. It is here that the people come to petition our government, to lobby and persuade us, and to ultimately discharge us if we fall too far from their democratic demands. And Ralph Regula from Ohio, I always have to have an Ohioan in it, because that's my hometown, said, in the future, the continued accessibility of our nation's capital will be shared without fear by millions because it will stand as a sacred testimony to the bravery of officers J.J. Chestnut and John Gibson, who are the two officers who died. And so you see that consistently the message is the Capitol is precious and access to the Capitol is precious. This is Bill Frist, who was at that time Senate Majority Leader, 3 days after the shooting, where you can see the typical flower memorial. But 3 days after the shooting, here are tourists in doing their visits. And then there was September 11th, the attack that was thwarted. And you can see staff members running. Nobody knew what was going on. Many of you were probably here on September 11th. And, you know, that was a very, very scary and chaotic day. And following that, as they saw you could see, you know, the smoke from the Pentagon, and the members gathered in an amazing show of unity and sang God Bless America, some totally off key, but they were all together doing that. And at that point is when Congress took the next step. They had authorized the Capitol Visitor Center after the 1998 shooting, but they funded it after September 11th. And now we have the Capitol Visitor Center. So I put that in to give you a sense of history, of what's gone on in the past. And we decided that we wanted to make sure we were watching, just like you were all watching, the polarization that happened so quickly after January 6th, where even the fact that something happened became a matter of discussion. And we decided that what we could do as the Capitol Historical Society was to give people an opportunity to do an oral history of telling their story. And this is a picture of me interviewing Shane Smith. Shane was working in Speaker Pelosi's office at the time, and he was on the floor, and his job was to be sort of the runner between the leader and the members, you know, just on a day-to-day basis. So it came to him to explain to the members that they had to put the hoods on. You know, remember that all this happened when there were a whole group of members who they'd taken office on January 3rd. They'd been members of Congress for 3 days. And so they really didn't know where they were, what was going on. And he described his own experience. We've done nearly 50 interviews. And the interesting thing is we give people the opportunity in their interviews to, if they want it to be held private for a period of time, we'll hold it private for a period of time, because we wanted to get, you know, as many perspectives as we can. About half the people who we've interviewed worked in Republican offices. I interviewed one guy it was such a compelling interview. He was a young guy, maybe 35, 36 years old. He wasn't 40. But he wasn't a baby. He'd been working in the Capitol for 5 years, from rural Virginia. And his mama, when he came to Washington 5 years before 2021, was not charmed with the whole situation, because she thought Washington was too dangerous and too scary, and she didn't want her baby son to be there. And he said, no, Mom, this is a great opportunity. And so she had gradually grown comfortable with him, being there. So here he is, he's in, and he had gotten what he considered a very plum assignment. The planning for the inauguration happens long before the election, like a year before the election. The Joint Committee on the Inauguration goes on. So we plan in this country an inauguration, not knowing who's going to get inaugurated, but knowing that someone's going to get inaugurated. And so the Joint Committee on the Inauguration is equally divided, Republican, Democrat, has a liaison from the Capitol Police, and they have a small office in the Capitol itself. And he was detailed to that office. So there were 10 of them in that office when the insurrection happened. And they happened to be on the 3rd floor by an elevator, and they got word from their police person who was in their, detail, that the police said they couldn't secure the elevator. And so they all had to barricade themselves in the suite. And the interesting thing is that the younger people who had all been through school shooting drills started to sort of lead the operation. They're like, okay, everybody get under, turn off all the noise on your cell phones, turn the noise off on the computers. Let's get under the table. Let's move the furniture. And, the older folks are going, oh my God. And, everybody's like going into full mode. And, they're meanwhile texting with their parents and their children and their spouses, depending on where they are with all of that. People are texting things like, here's where the will is. Here's my passwords to, I love you. I want you to remember whatever. This is what I want you to tell. I mean, just really compelling stories. I interviewed a woman who was the staff director for the House Administration Committee. So she was actually on duty. She was part of the operation for the electoral count, because that falls under that committee. And she was the Republican member. And she only finally did her interview about 2 months ago. She just said it was too close. And when she did the interview, she talked about the thing, what she was saying to her husband. They have 2 children who were at that time middle school and just starting high school. And the conversation, the kind of conversation she had with her husband, she said she couldn't even talk to her parents because she couldn't hear from them. She couldn't hear the freak out that they had. And she didn't want them to think she was in danger. Well, I interviewed one guy who, first I interviewed his daughter, who was an amazing woman, young African-American woman, first generation college, working for Nancy Pelosi, dream job, right? Working on the floor of the House. And she's on the floor of the House. And she talked about how she always she worked in the cloakroom, which is, where they all gather off the floor. And she always had in the cloakroom comfortable shoes. And then she had her high heels like, the young folks wear. And so she's clunking around in these high heels, but she had comfortable shoes. And when she realized what was going on, she changed into her comfortable shoes. And when they started to really say, okay, we got to get you out of here. They they made everybody who had high heels just take them off and run barefoot, which, you know, you don't even think about that part of it. And she was texting with her dad, and her dad was, you know, had been involved in civil rights, voter education, and had really encouraged her to get involved in politics. And she said her dad was just so concerned. She's from Texas. Her dad was like, you can't tell mom. You just can't tell mom this is going on. Now, mind you, mom probably noticed, you know, it was kind of a big story. But so she never texted, she never communicated with her mom, only with her dad. And her dad kept saying, I just feel so guilty. I feel so guilty. And, you know, here she was, she had this job. She was just gotten admitted to graduate school. She was going to graduate school at night. And so later I interviewed her dad. And I talked to him about what was his perspective being on the other end of, you know, receiving those text messages. And, you know, he said, now, it wasn't probably very reasonable for me to say, don't tell mom. Like, what did I think, that she wouldn't figure this out? He said, but I couldn't face it. And, you know, it was about 4 o'clock in the morning before she was home safe. And she went home to Texas for a couple days afterwards. And, you know, just the perspective to hear in his own words, this guy who, you can imagine, he was so proud of his daughter. And then he felt like, I have put my baby in danger. I can't imagine. We interviewed a police officer. We've actually interviewed 2 police officers, but I personally did one of the interviews. And he talked about the fact that they were saying to one another, this doesn't seem right. This seems worse than anticipated, that the intelligence just didn't seem to process. And then when the crowd was so big and turned on them, while they're meanwhile, you know, having flags that say, you know, Blue Lives Matter, and the dissonance about Blue Lives Matter, but we're going to, you know, take your own billy club, you know, take the shield and use it as a battering ram. And it was, he said, I was in combat. He was in Vietnam, he was in Afghanistan, Iraq, one of those, I forget where. And he said, this was worse. This was more out of control than being in hand-to-hand combat, because these people were just, you know, such passionate believers, and they had no, you know, no filter, no sense of that. They didn't think they were doing anything wrong. That was what was stunning to him, is that he said, because I asked everybody, I said, you know, I had sort of a set of structured questions. And one of the questions I always ask at the end is, if you could talk to the people who were part of this insurrection, what would you want to know? And this officer said, what I'd want to know is, why did you think this was okay? Why did you think this was fine? And so we have the interviews. We're still doing interviews, because it's not, you know, unfortunately for us, we were never able to. We kept trying to see if we could raise some money to really expand the numbers, and we never could. So we just did it with our own staff and volunteers. But even with that, even just the 50 we have is very representative, and we're keeping it open. We actually got people trained by the retired historian from the Senate, who was the president of the Oral History Association, very distinguished guy. And he was so patient and so calm with everybody. He was great. And he's set us up with the University of Kentucky, which has a very large oral history library, which is where we hope that we'll ultimately place these interviews so that they'll be available for history. We also ended up, one of the fascinating things is in this process, we became sort of the go-to for, verify, is that true? People started, say, we became the tell us if it's true kind of group. And I'll tell you, like, the most absurd question we got asked over and over again, is it true that Nancy Pelosi refused to have the National Guard there? Which the answer is Nancy Pelosi doesn't have the right to call the National Guard. DC is not a state. You perhaps know that. And the only person who can call the National Guard into action is the President of the United States. So that's, but the most absurd question we got asked is, in the course of a trial, one of the insurrectionists was being charged with entering the Capitol without authority. And so his lawyer says, well, he didn't know the Capitol wasn't open because there wasn't a sign. And now, mind you, we'd all been living with COVID. And so the Capitol hadn't really been open because of COVID. Plus, in order to get into the Capitol, you have to go through the doors and the metal detectors and all those kind of things. You don't break in the window to get there. That's not sort of the customary way you enter. And there's no sign that says, do not enter through the windows, go through the doors. And so I'm like, my comms guy comes into me and says, Jane, what would you like to say? I said, and I'm not allowed to say the lawyer's out of his mind, so I had to craft a civilized conversation. So that's the kind of interesting things that we did. So I'm happy to answer questions. I want to tell you a little bit about the rest of the society, but y'all tuned in, you must have something on your mind.
Jane, we've got a question right away in the chat. And it's, you mentioned volunteers who help with this oral history effort. How did they contribute their time? How many volunteers were involved? Do you still want additional volunteers?
Our volunteers are precious. We had actually, we have maybe on this particular project, we have about 10 volunteers. They went through a 3-hour training program about how to conduct an oral history. And they've done 3 things. They've helped do outreach to encourage people to tell their oral histories, because we actually interviewed people who were not in the Capitol, but had friends in the Capitol, so they were on the other end of the messages. We also interviewed people who worked in the Capitol but weren't there that day, but they're we interviewed one person who said, I just felt so guilty because I wasn't there. Well, he wasn't there, he had COVID. That's why he wasn't there. I was like, William, hello, but his story was he was communicating, he was the chief of staff to one of the senators who you would not anticipate being, very generous on these matters. And he just felt so guilty that he wasn't there. So they've done some interviews, they've done some outreach to encourage interviews, and they've done some follow-up. So as we right now, our biggest challenge is to get people to tell us their stories. And so we probably need more help reaching out to get people to tell their stories than we do doing the interviews. But if someone is interested in getting trained to do oral history, we would be happy to work on that as well. So let me know.
You've got another question right along those same lines. It says, I'd be interested in knowing more about the volunteer interviewing.
Well, I mean, one of our volunteer interviewers, you probably have heard his voice, Ron Elving, who's on NPR. He's on our board, and he did a lot of interviews. And then we have another gentleman who's on our board, did about volunteer interviewing. He was the NBC newscaster when I was in Cleveland. He was in Cleveland. And he's now in Washington and no longer actively on the news, but he's an amazing interviewer. I mean, he can, draw out of people the best of their stories. He's just really very, very engaged. So, we try to work with people who have some experience doing interviews, so that we can really make the most of it, because it's a two-way street.
Here's another one. Have you interviewed members of the FBI and asked them why they weren't prepared or appeared not to be prepared to defend the Capitol?
We have not interviewed the FBI. We have only, and we have, our perspective on the interviews is we ask people to tell their story and their experience. Unlike, and one of the difficulties was, we started this before the January 6th committee got up and running full time, full bore. As they got up and running and it became so confrontational and interrogation, we had to go out of our way to say, we're not here to try to, investigate why you did something wrong. We're here for you to tell us what is your experience. So we really wouldn't be the ones to say to the FBI, why didn't you know this? Now we have informal conversations, not on the record, with some folks who we know who work for the FBI. And the FBI did have the information, did share the information, but it didn't work its way up the chain.
Let me ask a couple of questions. How do you choose
At
people?
some point, Trudy, can I say something? It's not a
Sure.
question.
Sorry.
This is Sheridan. Jane, I've been listening to your talks for the last couple of years, all through the pandemic. And this is a plug. I found their lectures, Tuesdays and Thursdays, usually just amazing. Right after January 6th, they had several talks about it. They've done all the Bill of Rights, what I now know about the Second Amendment that I didn't know before. So pay attention to the lectures, and you can get them after the fact. But I've been telling all my friends about how wonderful they are. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheridan. And you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to figure out how to stop sharing my screen. And
You
so,
have.
Oh, did I? Okay, so
Yes.
we can all be together. Okay, that's great.
Couple
see.
questions. How do you choose people to interview? For example, would you take people from the neighborhood
Absolutely.
to be in? And you said you had a basic set of questions. Can you tell us a little bit about the basic set of questions?
I can. I actually. So here's what I start with. Where were you when on January 6th? And in the lead up to January 6th, what were you doing? Were you aware that there was unrest? And what were your colleagues telling you? How were you getting information? Did you, get any warnings? And tell us your own personal experience. What happened to you? And how did you track what was going on? That's an interesting, like some people got it from they had the TV, like some of the people who were in the building, they heard the noise, but the only way they got information was from the TV or from Twitter or texts. And then how did you describe your experience to your family and your friends? And what steps have you taken to return to normal? Is normal the same or is it different? And has that experience changed your outlook on life or work? And what would you say if you could have a conversation with the perpetrators? And does it still linger in your mind? So those are the kind of questions really key to people's, telling their own story.
Mhm.
And it's amazing. People talk about their family and their children and their mothers and their fathers, most of anything.
And we have a fairly long question here. My neighbor is in the National Guard and was on the literal front line. He has a news photo. He's clearly seen in pushing against the protesters' front line. Would you want to interview him? Although on second thought, he may not be allowed to comment. I tell his children that he was a witness and player in American history. Do you tape these conversations and then later transcribe them? What will ultimately be the product of this historical society activity? Where will it live or be archived?
Yes, we absolutely would like to talk to him. We've gotten preliminary feedback that the National Guard folks are allowed to speak on their own experience. Not on why were you called up, not called up, not to comment on that, but how did it feel to you, to yourself? Yes, we tape them, they're videotaped, and we transcribe them. We actually have an artificial intelligence transcription that we use, and it's been really good. So it's kind of weird, kind of freaky. And we send the transcription to the interviewer and the interviewee to review, to correct errors. Like sometimes, the AI may have heard, Sarah, and they put in Saren, or, and it ends up having a different meaning. And so people sign off that the transcription does really meet, does comport with their memory. The interviews usually last about an hour, and we are preserving those, and we're working with the Oral History Archives at the University of Kentucky. They have apparently developed an expertise in oral history archival activities. And so we are attempting to, work with them to have them, and they've been open to it. So
we have another person who says we have a family member who was doing construction on the Capitol in the fall of 2020 and into January. And he said that 2 or 3 days before January 6th, his team was told to remove all their equipment from the Capitol, as they knew that that's the end of the comment.
we would be honored to interview these folks, because our sort of philosophy is that January 6th and the insurrection affected not just the staff, not just the congressional staff, it affected the community, it affected the contractors, it affected the police officers, it affected the families of the people involved. So, if people want, they can, on our website, where there's the January 6th, there's a form that someone can fill out, that, here you go, that you want to share. It's in the chat here, that you want to share your story, and then that will connect us with, we'll get you hooked up. We'll talk about what time, and we like to do these in person. We have done them by Zoom. We think they're more compelling if someone was willing to come in person. And we have a, sort of, we've made an office into a sort of a makeshift studio. So we're not it's not CNN, but it's good quality. The video works, and I think it's a meaningful thing, and it'd be really super helpful if y'all had some of these, because it's the people who've done it is somebody tells somebody, and every single person who's done it leaves going, I'm so glad I told this story, because I want to know that my children and grandchildren will be able to hear firsthand what this experience was.
Jane, we only have a little under 10 minutes left. You wanted to talk a little about the Historical Society itself. Do you want to do that now?
Yeah, and Sheridan gave my commercial, so I think that's great. Thank you very much. But I think if you're interested in this, you'd be interested in the rest of our work. And we do, one of the things we learned, you always try to find what's the good that you can find out of something quite grim. And the good out of the pandemic is that we learned how to create virtual programming. And one of the things that's magical about virtual programming is that we literally have a list of Pulitzer Prize winning historians, and we just call them up and say, hey, listen, Dr. So-and-so, we're going to do a webinar about something that we know they know about. It's their area. And all they have to do is sit in front of their computer, turn it on, make a 30-minute presentation, answer questions about something that they know. And so we get really high quality speakers. And it's just it's a lot of fun because I get to interview most of them. So, and I was a history major in college, so this is like handy, going in and doing it. And we're in the process now of doing a series about the amendments to the Constitution. As Sheridan said, we started with the Bill of Rights, but we're taking each amendment, and we have a scholar who's talking about what was going on at the time that the amendment was passed. What were the political debates? Why was it passed? Why did they think it was so important that they should amend the Constitution? And how has it been interpreted since that time? So we're doing the 13th Amendment on Thursday. And we normally do these on Thursdays at 12 o'clock, 12 to 1. And, as we were talking with Trudy and Mary at the beginning, you guys are always done out by 8, plan. And so we are 12 to 1, we're done at 1. Sometimes when we have a really compelling speaker, a compelling topic, if the speaker's willing, we'll end it and say we've got a bonus 10 minutes, so you can stay on for 10 extra minutes. But it is really lots of fun and very informative. And all of those are available on our website. You can go on and listen to them, anytime. So it's not like if you're not there at that particular moment, you don't miss the moment. The other thing we're doing, which we would love for you to help encourage people to know about, is when we faced the pandemic, we had been doing what we call the We the People Constitution Tour, which is an in-person tour for 8th graders in Washington, D.C. schools, in Title I schools. And we take them to the Capitol, to the steps of the Supreme Court, to the National Archives, and to the White House Visitor Center, and talk about the 3 branches of government, show them the archives, the actual documents that established, and that the Constitution lives here in Washington, D.C. for them, and that they are part of it. When we had to shut everything down, we went to a virtual model to create, as much virtual resources as we could. And those virtual resources, once we had them, we said, well, they can be available for people across the country. And so we have created a We the People Constitution Tour virtual learning hub So if you know anyone who knows a civics teacher or has a kid that would love to look at some cool resources, we also developed two plays that tell stories that can be broken up into segments with lesson plans. One about the civil rights movement in Mississippi, and one about the end of Reconstruction. And so the students can watch a scene of the play, and then there is a lesson plan that goes together with that. Because sometimes you can reach people even on a screen watching a play in a way that reading a book or listening to a lecture isn't quite the same. So we'd love for you to share those. And we'd love you to become a member of the Capitol Historical Society. You know, that's how we support ourselves. So sign up and join. We'd love to have you.
Well, thank you, Jane. We have loved to have you too here with us tonight. I'm not seeing other hands or questions in the chat. So let me just remind you all that on March 7, we are going to be listening to Don Cohn talk about COVID, Biden, Putin, the Fed, who done it, and what's next. And for tonight, let's thank Jane, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us.